Hi, final expense winners. This is Stephen Lowry at Security National Life Insurance Company. And today I'm going to go through my 4 questions presentation. This is the presentation that I generally use when I'm at a kitchen table selling final expense insurance. I didn't make this presentation up. I learned it from another agent years ago, and it's called the 4 questions presentation. Now, the first thing I do is I approach the door with a lead card in my hand. I am a direct mail producer. That's how I like to do my business. So I knock on the door. When the prospect answers, let's pretend it's Mrs. Jones. I say, Mrs. Jones, my name is Stephen Lowry, and I'm here today because a few weeks ago, my office sent you this postcard in the mail, and I show Mrs. Jones the card. Let me remind you what it says. It says that you may qualify for a state-regulated program to pay your final expenses regardless of your medical condition, even if you've been turned down before. Now, it's my job to deliver the information that you asked for when you signed this card and sent it back to us. This is your signature, correct? And Mrs. Jones will say, yeah, that's my signature. And I'll say, well, good. Can I come in and sit down for just a few minutes and I can find out which information you're qualified to receive? Mrs. Jones is generally going to take me to the kitchen table and we're going to sit down. At that point, I slide the card across the kitchen table and I repeat myself. Mrs. Jones, this card says that you may qualify for a state-regulated program to pay your final expenses regardless of your medical condition, even if you've been turned down before. And I'm always curious, Mrs. Jones, why a person would send me this card back in the mail. And so I'm going to ask you that question, why did you send it? But before you answer, what most people tell me is they send it because they don't want to be a burden for their loved ones. 9 times out of 10, Mrs. Jones is going to nod her head up and down and say, yeah, I don't want to be a burden for my loved ones. So I'm going to take that opportunity to ask her, who are your loved ones? And she'll usually say her kids, Susie and Tim. Mrs. Jones, do Susie and Tim have kids of their own? Generally, they do. And I write that down on my piece of notebook paper. So if I'm hearing you correctly, Mrs. Jones, what you were trying to accomplish is to put a plan in place for your final expenses so that your children, Susie and Tim, don't have to take away from their own families in order to put you in your final resting place with dignity. Is that correct? And she will agree with me. So I'm doing this on purpose. What I'm trying to do is to give Mrs. Jones the opportunity to agree with me several times. And so I've given her that opportunity and she's agreed. Now, Mrs. Jones, generally when we buy things or when we send a card back looking for information, there are 4 questions that we hope to get answered. Do you mind if I go through those questions with you? And she'll say, no, that's no problem at all. Well, Mrs. Jones, the first question is generally, how much? How much life insurance should a person have? Mrs. Jones, how much do you think your final expenses will be? Mrs. Jones will generally give me a number that is similar to $10,000 because everybody thinks that's what a funeral costs. Well, Mrs. Jones, I think you're absolutely right. Somewhere around $10,000 is what funerals tend to cost. But let me draw you a quick picture. Money goes this way and time goes this way. Would you agree with me, Mrs. Jones, that over time, the price of everything goes up? And she'll say, yeah, the price of everything does go up over time. And I'll say, okay, Mrs. Jones, so this little dot represents today, and today a funeral costs $10,000. But you're going to die somewhere down here, and your funeral's going to cost this much. I don't know what that number is, but it's more than $10,000. Is that right? And Mrs. Jones will say yes. Well, Mrs. Jones, does that mean that your funeral will cost more than $10,000? Therefore, you need more than $10,000 worth of insurance? And she'll say, yeah, I probably do. And I say, Mrs. Jones, I have a different answer. Do you mind if I share my answer of how much insurance you should have? And she'll say, no, go ahead. And then I write this down on the paper and I turn it around and I show it to her. You need an amount that's easy to afford. Is that the correct answer, Mrs. Jones? Is that how much insurance you need? And she'll say, yes, Stephen, that is exactly the right amount of insurance for me, an amount that's easy to afford. Great, so we have an agreement. Mrs. Jones, let's move to question number 2, which is what kind of insurance should a person have? Do you know the difference between term life and whole life? And it doesn't matter what her answer is. She'll say yes or no. Either way, I'm going to say, would you mind if I go through it really quickly just for my own benefit? And she'll say, sure, go ahead. So I write this down. I like to ask Mrs. Jones to sit to my right so that she can see what I'm writing on the paper. Term life is temporary. That's why they call it term, Mrs. Jones. When the term comes to an end, the insurance disappears. Whole life is permanent. It lasts your whole life. We like to use whole life insurance for final expense planning because we don't know when you're going to pass away and we want the insurance to be in place when that happens. Term life has a cost that rises. Whole life has a level cost. Term life has no cash. Whole life has cash. Do you know what I mean when I say that, Mrs. Jones? She'll say, no, I don't know what you mean. What I mean is this. Life insurance is a bucket. Every month you put a little money into your bucket. And when you pass away, your beneficiary uses the money that's in the bucket to pay for your final expenses. Now, with term life, when the term is over, the payment goes away and the bucket goes away and there's no insurance at all. But whole life is different. Whole life has a smaller bucket inside it, and that bucket has money in it. That money is your cash value. You can use it while you're still alive. I don't recommend it, but you can borrow against your policy. I bet someone in your life has said that to you, that they had borrowed from their policy. Well, that person had whole life insurance, and they got the money from the little bucket. You do have to pay it back, though. Or if someday you can't afford your policy anymore, you can move the little bucket out and have a reduced paid up policy, or you can surrender your policy for cash. That's why cash value is so important. So Mrs. Jones, for final expense planning, would you agree with me that whole life insurance is the correct type of insurance to solve that problem? She's going to say yeah, so you'll circle that. Now, Mrs. Jones, we've agreed on two things. One is that the proper amount of insurance for a person is an amount that's easy to afford. And we've agreed that whole life is the correct type of insurance for planning final expenses. Is that correct? And she'll say yeah. Okay, Mrs. Jones, our third question is, who should you buy it from? Where should you get your insurance? Well, insurance companies have basically 3 flavors of life insurance: good, better, and best. And that's based on your health. Not everyone qualifies for the best insurance, but a lot of people do. And it's good that you can have an agent come to your house today, because I can look at you and ask you these questions. And if you are qualified for best, I can get you into a policy like that. What best means is it has first day coverage. Now, you've heard of policies that have a 2-year waiting period, correct? Well, those are the good policies. There's nothing wrong with them. They're wonderful policies. They do have that 2-year return of premium period. And there will usually be about a 10% interest rate added to the top of that. The better coverage is also first day, but it costs a little more. It's for people that have a minor health condition. So I'm going to ask you a few health questions, if you don't mind, so I can find out which plan you would be qualified for. I'm going to start at the top of your head and I'm going to work my way down. Have you ever had a stroke? Do you have seizures? Do you have Alzheimer's or dementia? Tell me about your heart, Mrs. Jones. Do you have an irregular heartbeat? Have you had a heart attack in the last 2 years or a pacemaker? Have you received any stents? And I just kind of go through the list of the common medical problems. And of course, at this point, I'm looking around the house as well. I'm looking for ashtrays. I'm looking for inhalers, oxygen tanks, walkers, wheelchairs, anything that might affect the underwriting class. And at the end, no matter which underwriting class the client goes into, I'm going to congratulate them that they're qualified for coverage. And if it's the good plan, I'm going to remind them that it is good and it does return a 10% interest rate, which is a wonderful investment in any market. And also that it does have a built-in accidental death benefit that will cover the full face amount in the event of an accident in the first 24 months. And finally, the fourth question, Mrs. Jones, when should you buy your insurance? Well, Mrs. Jones, insurance has a price that is based on your health conditions and your age. Your age is going to keep going up, and as your health goes up, it will only become more expensive to buy insurance. And as we get older, we tend to become less healthy, so that can affect the price as well. So today is the right time to buy your insurance, because today I will only offer you a plan that is easy to afford, which we agreed is the right number. I will only offer you a whole life plan that is permanent, that has a level cost that will never rise, that will build a cash value. It can't be canceled by us, only you can cancel it. Today, you're qualified for our best coverage because your health is so excellent. But the most important question is the first question, Mrs. Jones. What's an amount that's easy to afford for you? If I can design a plan for you today that is whole life, that is permanent, that has a cost that will never rise, is $100 a month something that's easy for you to afford? And Mrs. Jones will always say, well, heck no, I can't afford $100 a month. Stephen? Okay. Mrs. Jones, your plan is not going to cost you $100 a month. Is $70 a month an amount that you can easily afford? Mrs. Jones will say, well, that's better. Well, Mrs. Jones, your plan's not going to cost you $70 a month. Is $50 a month something that you could easily afford, even if your car got a flat tire, even if your refrigerator went out and you had to get it fixed? And Mrs. Jones generally is going to say, yeah, I can afford $50 a month. Okay, Mrs. Jones, what's your social? At this point, you're giving her the quote. You're finding out how much insurance she can buy for $50 a month based on her health and her age. And you're going to write up that application. That's my whole sales presentation, Final Expense Winners. I hope that works for you. I hope it's useful for you. Thank you, and go out there and write some insurance.